Thank you. Can I have the panelists, the whole set of panelists back up here, and Karen Hammerness is going to kick this off and moderate the discussion.
I'm sort of reminded of this joke about PowerPoints. I don't have PowerPoints either, but Linda Darling Hammond told this great joke, which was absolute power corrupts, but absolute PowerPoints corrupt absolutely. And I'm kind of reminded of this as we're all sort of struggling with the technology. But basically what I want to do in just kind of framing this conversation is to return to this really beautiful discussion of dilemmas in teacher education, kind of these long-standing challenges. And I want to take a couple that have already been mentioned, and then I want to raise you a dilemma as well. And what I'm also going to push us a little bit to do in the ensuing conversation is to give some particular examples of curricula, of pedagogy, of assignments that are being enacted in these different programs so that we can kind of get below a little bit of the generalization. Suzanne, you were sort of pushing us in thinking about teacher education to really sort of get below these perhaps superficial characterizations and start to think about how these things actually look in teacher education. So I'm going to ask the panelists when they respond to some of these questions that I'm going to raise, if you can perhaps give some examples of what that actually looks like in your programs. I think that will really help us get below these initial features that we're describing. So the first dilemma that I want to return to is this dilemma that Jack called specificity versus generality. This question of, are we preparing teachers for all settings, or are we preparing them for the specific setting in which they're actually going to be teaching? And I've been looking at a lot of these kinds of programs that we've started to call context-specific programs like the University of Chicago's Urban Teacher Education Program that prepares teachers specifically for the Chicago Public Schools, provides opportunities to learn about the particular kinds of school types in Chicago, is framed by an understanding of the geography of Chicago, the affordances of the communities, the kind of historical context of education in Chicago. I've also been looking at and working closely with others who are thinking about how you prepare people for specific settings like New York City. And I'm also reminded of the work of the University of Illinois' teacher pipeline. I don't know if Robert Lee is here. Oh, there you are. Who thinks, sorry. But the teacher pipeline program that prepares new teachers by giving them opportunities to live in the homes of folks who live in the communities in which they'll be teaching. So it's a very different way of thinking about how you prepare people to understand the assets of the communities and the children in which you're going to be teaching. So it's interesting to hear about these programs because in some ways you could say that these two programs are somewhat devoid of context. And the phrase that Emily used, which was equip anyone, anywhere in the world to teach, which raises this, sort of interesting dilemma. But at the same time, you can understand or imagine some of the affordances that a program might provide for people to look across context and to start to identify similarities or patterns across different kinds of contexts. But I think, in a way, we also cannot sort of ignore the fact that, as Suzanne brought up, all of this is happening within this kind of larger public conversation about race and class and gender. So these are things that our teachers are constantly coming into contact with and need to be able to be equipped to really deal with sensitively and in a deep way. So I'm very curious about sort of how these two programs are thinking about this dilemma of specificity and context. So perhaps we should start with that, and then I can come to the next dilemma, because it looks like people are already ready to jump in. So I would love to start talking about this. So go.
I apologize. When I said we were interested in all kinds of schools, what I meant was we had to be able to show that the idea of competency assessment, problem-based curriculum would work in preparing teachers for all kinds of schools. The reality is we prepare people for specific kinds of schools. When I talked about our teaching fellowship, we asked Purdue, for example, create a program for rural schools. The issues in rural schools are not the same as the issues in urban schools. It doesn't make sense to prepare a physics teacher for an urban school. That's not enough. That physics teacher better be able to do math. English wouldn't be bad as another subject either. What's also true is, if you're creating a mentoring program, mentoring students who are 150 miles apart is different than mentoring students who are 5 blocks apart. so that the structure of the program, the nature of the students that teacher has to work with, the kind of field experiences they have, need to be targeted at the population that's going to be taught. What we're hoping is, as we develop our program, I talked about virtuals and simulations, they can be geared to particular kinds of schools that we're preparing students for.
We deal with specificity all the time, every minute, and the specificity comes from the candidate. So if we have a cohort of people and somebody's teaching in the inner city in New York or Washington or rural area in Mississippi or in the middle of Saudi Arabia or Ecuador, they bring that specificity. Let me give you an example of an activity that sort of, and they're all like this. Instead of, in our program, for example, telling people about the requirements of what used to be No Child Left Behind, or the law, our activity is go out and find out what the laws are in your country that are education laws, and read them and talk about them. And they have to make a video of the impact of those laws on the life of a teacher. And then they come into the virtual classroom and everybody sees everybody else's videos. We've had people do sock puppet shows, and I mean, it's pretty amazing. But then they come together and they actually discuss the impact of external regulations and rules on day-to-day practice of teaching. And the learning that comes out of that is on the basis of about 12 different specific settings that those teachers find themselves in. That happens in our special education treatment, or the learning around special ed students. We have candidates where countries don't pay any attention to special ed needs of students. And they're in a cohort of people where the rules and laws around that in the US are really quite stringent. So the collaborative learning and the sharing of actual teaching experiences and expectations of teachers is specific to each candidate who's in that cohort.
No, that's very helpful, and it's actually one of the questions that we often get asked when we present some of the work that we're doing on context-specific teacher education, which is, well, then if people move, settings, then how are they being prepared? So it's sort of this balance between thinking about what are the principles of learning about a context that you might take across context, and also balancing with this sort of need to really get specific and local. So it's again, but it's helpful to hear some of the specifics about how you're doing this. So let me raise a second dilemma, which is this question of the balance between theory and practice and the kind of linkages between the two. And it's interesting that, Arthur, you didn't mention this as much as you did in the piece that you gave us to read, but that you have identified some particular practices and some competencies that you are hoping that the program will focus on. And I'm curious about, sort of how do you decide which practices to focus on? What's the rationale for doing so? Why Charlotte Danielson, for instance? Because there's a lot of conversation about practice and why you pick particular practices. There's the work by Doug Lamoff that's, linking the rationale for picking those practices to direct, impact on student outcome. But you could also pick practices that are really grounded in learning theory, or you could pick practices as you have that are the kinds of things that people are looking for when they're observing teaching. So I'd be curious about sort of what's the rationale behind the selection of these kinds of particular practices and competencies. So that's kind of one, one related question. I think the other one is a kind of a broader question about the theories. So it's not only about the rationale, but what are the theories about teacher learning and teacher development that are driving these choices? And I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit about sort of both those questions, the practices and then the theories behind them. If you're ready, yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Couple of items. First thing, one of the things that you mentioned was Doug Lamoff. We really do have this conflict over whether teaching's a craft or a profession. Is it something like being a newspaper reporter that you learn on the job? Or is it more like being a brain surgeon in which you need a very extensive education before you do it? I think it's a profession. And I'd add that I tend to think that programs like Doug's were intended to be remedies to what were perceived as limitations within the university model. And I think what they managed to do was create caricatures. What they created were mirror images in which students may have been taught the practices they need for tomorrow, but they haven't been given the arsenal of theory and skills in order to think about what one does if that thing doesn't work tomorrow, or how one plans an education for students. In terms of what we're doing, why Charlotte? We needed to begin somewhere. And the idea never was that we would embrace a set of competencies. Hook, line, and sinker. We're talking about preparing students who can negotiate two worlds. I've talked about a world that exists today and the kinds of schools we have today. But we're also talking about the kinds of schools that are going to emerge tomorrow, which I think will be learner-centered rather than teacher-centered, which will be individualized. How do you prepare a group of teachers who can work in current schools and still have the capacity to move those schools toward the future? In essence, that's what we built the program around. Those are the kinds of problems we built in were the problems we dealt with, what we saw as the principal problems that all teachers deal with, have to know how to deal with, the challenges. We built the theory and we built the practice, we think, into each. And the tool, the question is, can we create the assessment devices that will adequately show mastery in those areas?
You really should license Teach Now.
You want it to be open source?
Maybe.
There's no licensing fee.
The way we deal with theory and practice is we make all the theories available to our candidates. We started with Charlotte Danielson and decided that 41 was too many. Charlotte Danielson built, and as I said, she's a friend of mine, she built her framework on the NTAS standards. We looked at Deborah Ball's. We looked at Marzano, we looked at everybody's, and we crosswalked them all and chose the basic NTAS standards on which to build our curriculum. We don't teach, nor do we want to teach a teacher how to get kids to hold their hands the right way if that's what they're being asked to do for some learning purpose. When in our module on managing the learning environment, it's filled with videos of good, bad, and indifferent classroom management. The best ones are from YouTube, and they're kids sitting in a classroom videoing their buddies acting up, and the teacher is like doing nothing or doing whatever. So we don't really necessarily go to the teaching channel, which sort of filters its videos. So we really do use a lot of open source materials, and in the context of that learning environment of that cohort with the instructor who is an expert in managing the learning environment, they actually review these kinds of materials. And I hate to say it for those of you that hate to hear it, but you come up with some really, really good suggested practices for how best to handle any of those theoretically based classroom management principles that we hold up, and in many cases they don't even apply in most classrooms today anyway.
be
Yeah,
allowed.
yeah, I want to make sure that other panelists have a chance to chime in.
I just wanted to tack onto this one more complication in thinking about, say, managing dilemmas. And one of the complications here is that when we're managing dilemmas, it isn't that we're engaging in a kind of cool, rational decision-making process where we say, on the one hand, there's this value, on the other hand, there's this value. Let's figure out where we're going to drop the arrow, because there are contexts in which we exist that shape the way we are seeing this. And one of those contexts, and I'll pick one that came up in Emily's talk, is what teachers think they see in their own practice because of the immediacy and the urgency of the problem of getting control over the classroom and figuring out what the heck you're doing on day one, versus once you've got that settled, thinking about who you are as a practitioner who maybe received a lot of training that didn't bear fruit on day one, but that has maybe quietly borne fruit over the past 5 or 10 years in a way that you can't actually measure because you don't have a clear pre and post the way you do in year one as a teacher, right? So that would require, this is the second time I'm going to suggest somebody invent a time machine today. Because again, so I talk about this with my wife, who was trained at Penn and who complained for her entire first year that everything she learned there was completely useless. And so I try to talk through with her about Time Machine Katie versus the Katie who happens to continue to live with me. And I think Time Machine Katie is not the same teacher, however many years, she's 9 years in as a teacher, as the Katie who I've continued to watch not go into a time machine and continue to develop as a teacher. I think Time Machine Katie and regular Katie would have had a pretty similar experience in year one, and would have both been really desperate for some really practical tools for planning a lesson, keeping the kids interested and under control. But I think if we could run this experiment, that the two Katies would be really different teachers in year 5, year 10, year 20, year 40. And so I wanted to add one more complication here, and that's that when we're thinking about managing these dilemmas, that there are things that are pulling us towards one side or the other that are not necessarily the product of just sitting around in an air-conditioned room and reasoning through what we value.
Bill?
Yeah, I would like to ask both of you, you alluded to it, Art, and you mentioned my name when you talked about math. How do you handle the fact of the varied income, the backgrounds of those who come in as to what kind of mathematics or any other subject matter? It's just that I know more about mathematics. How do you control for that? It is a number of courses, a set of particular courses, and how do you deal with the fact that different people at different levels need different mathematics, not just the amount, but the nature of it? And Emily, you're doing it worldwide, where mathematics is not the same thing from country to country. So how does that get built into this, given what importance we showed that really makes as to what teachers' backgrounds are with respect to the subject matter they're going to teach? And it doesn't have to be just math, but it's that general subject matter, content knowledge. Where do you get it when you come into a program that doesn't do it? You have to, I presume, set standards as to what comes in, and how do you handle that?
Well, we ask people when they come into the teacher certification program what area they're seeking to be certified in. We don't teach content pedagogy in Teach Now per se. The last 15 weeks of a 9-month program are devoted to the practice of teaching, and 3 of those weeks are devoted to a deep dive into the candidates' resurrection of their past academic background in the field that they're going to be actually doing their practice teaching in. So they have to practice teach in the field they're getting certified to teach in. And we do look at transcripts so that you don't have somebody who has no background in math even able to get a math teaching certificate. To answer your question around variability of what's needed to teach math in different environments and at different grade levels, we're really agnostic on it because the teacher is actually teaching in a school, and the practice teaching that they're doing is specific to what is needed of them in that environment. So in that period of the program is really where they're focused on math teaching proficiency, and we don't expect that they have it. That's why they're practicing teaching with a mentor teacher who is experienced and has all of the background that's needed for best practices of teaching in it. But we also really, really, really believe in collaborative learning and learning on the job.
They can learn math collaboratively?
No, I said they can't get in the program unless they've taken math, unless they have a math.
Do you have a set requirements?
We do, but I don't know what they are. Yeah.
So I'd just like to make an observation. So I'm going back to Jack's, so we figured some things out. I'm struck by how similar the things in these two new programs are to what happens in teacher preparation programs around the country at one level. And I'm surprised, actually, at that. Which is like we have agreed on a set of things that, that should be a part of teacher preparation. And I'm also struck by how difficult it is to learn across programs about the things that you're doing. I mean, we pushed, both of you to say things that are quite specific, but I feel like I'm still at a loss to know whether I would know at Michigan State how to learn from what's in your program, Emily. That you're getting good success on the markers that are the markers that the country uses on these things.
Well, my answer to that question, I don't know what Art's is, contrary to those of you who know me, contrary to my historical behavior, I intentionally built Teach Now under the radar. This was a big, big undertaking. And it involved bringing people in about areas that I know nothing about, like e-learning and software development. And so we've brought in some very, very high-level tech experts. And first of all, you had to make sure that the platform didn't crash and burn. You can't have a bunch of people in a program and not have it work. So that took over a year and a half to just build the software for this program. Then we were building the content at the same time, and we had to make sure that we had the right content. I mean, the reason the content is similar that you're hearing is because the states have rules about what you have to cover. I mean, you can't have a teacher certification program unless it meets the state's requirements. But they're not bad requirements, and they're pretty much all based on. So the reason you haven't heard about Teach Now is because I've been really careful about this and thoughtful, and
But my point wasn't that I haven't heard about it. It's now that I've heard about it, I don't know how to learn. I don't even know quite how I would go about figuring out how to learn from the things that you've put together. And this isn't specific to you. This is a sort of general problem in teacher preparation. It's pretty hard to learn from the things that work well in other programs and figure out how to bring them into your own program.
well,
Nothing specific to you.
we do intend to do a lot more writing about it and a lot more making it available now that we know how good it is.
Can I just make sure that folks at the end of the table have a chance to chip in if they want to? I know you would like to, Arthur, but I just want to make sure that, is there anybody else down at the end that would like to chime in before Arthur responds?
Very brief comment. I think one of the reasons why it may seem so similar what they're doing to university programs is that both of them said they believe that these programs should meet the same standards as all programs. That's about to change. And when we see some of the legislation in the new federal law enacted, there's going to be a push for not holding all programs to the same standard. So I think the entry programs we've seen so far, and so I think that accounts for some of the similarity, because they're meeting the same state standards and accreditation standards.
Julie, you wanted to respond.
It's just along the same lines. And I'm wondering specifically.
Mike.
So when you talk about the idea of repair versus replacement, what like specific aspects of your program you see as actual replacements versus repairs, I think would be helpful for me in thinking about the ways in which your programs are in fact distinct from a program like mine, which is in many ways a more traditional university-based program.
When American higher education made the transition from the agrarian to the industrial society, we adopted one of the best technologies that exist. And this should not be seen as sarcastic. I really do believe this. We adopted an assembly line model in which the time was fixed and the process was fixed. The outcomes were variable. So that all of us use either you have to take X number of credits or you have to take X number of courses. And what we're saying is all people don't learn at the same rates. You can't measure it in time. We can't do it all in 15 weeks. And instead what we're saying is throw out the clock and focus instead on outcomes. All that matters is learning. All that matters is achieving the competencies. The challenges that are there in order to build on deficiencies that people bring to the program. Before entering a challenge on assessment, we will have assessed what people know and can do and have them go through in terms of the challenge products based upon what they don't know and can't do. It's a very different kind of model to that extent. One could point to it and say, oh yeah, they're just calling courses challenges. We're not. What we're really saying is the model needs to fundamentally change and will.
I think that really distinguishing.
Emily, I'm going to cut you off because we're going to move on to lunch. So join me in thanking Karen and the panel, please.